are trickling. I know people are trickling in, but I want to get us started. So I am completely delighted, if you could not tell from the previous chit chat we were having, to have Lauren Ponisio here. Lauren Ponisio is a assistant professor, or sorry, wait.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, an assistant professor at University of Oregon. She moved to Oregon very recently during the year of COVID in 2020. Previously, she was an assistant professor at UC Riverside, and so we are sad to have her leave the UC system, but she's still doing a lot of work in California. Prior to her appointment at Riverside, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, and before that, she was a PhD student in my graduate department, Environmental Science Policy and Management at UC Berkeley. As a fun fact, she is from Fresno, and I know her well, both as a quantitative ecologist and as an entomologist, and she studies work. She also does a lot of work on fire in the Sierra Nevada as well, which is also where we've interacted. But the title of her talk today is Wild and Managed Bees. And well, I'll come back and read it, but I will say Lauren wants to be interrupted during her talk. Not wants to, but if you have questions that cannot wait, feel free to raise your hand. We'll be monitoring, and so we can allow you to interrupt her and ask questions, and she's very fine with that. Otherwise, you can ask in the Q&A and I will interrupt her. But she's open to that, so letting you know. The title of her talk is Wild and Managed Bees in California Agriculture. Flowers are bee door knobs, and there is no silver bullet determining grower bee-friendly practice adoption. That's a great subtitle. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, podcast soon to happen. It's gonna be great, but I thought it'd be nice to have a bit of the subtitle, because there's so much interesting stuff to talk about in terms of wild managed bees in agriculture. I thought this would be a good relevant talk since you guys are all in California. P.S. Oregon is basically California. It's my first time leaving California, and everyone here are Californians. So I don't know what happened there, but hopefully one day people can visit. Well, let's start. So I'm not entirely sure how it happened, but very quickly I've already become, I'm being guided by my amazing postdocs in the lab, and those are Hamutal Cohen, Jenny Durant, Gordon Smith, as well as our lab manager, Jocelyn Zorn. So I want to give them a shout out that a lot of this work is stuff that they've led that I'll be presenting on. So thanks everyone for working so hard. It will be no surprise to people here that agriculture is expanding with our population and also just the commodification of agriculture. And it is now occupying a really large percentage of the terrestrial land area, and that is only expected to increase. So many of you have probably know that agriculture often is associated with being not the best place for biodiversity. And so the future of biodiversity really hinges on our ability to make agriculture better for wildlife, and at the same time, likely people as well. And this agriculture tends to be, a lot of this agriculture is very pollinator dependent. It does come on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there are things like grapes, which really don't rely much on pollinators. And on the other hand, we have things like almond and sunflower, hybrid sunflower, that are 100% pollinator dependent. So every almond is individually pollinated, and as well as every sunflower seed. And then in the middle, you have awesome things like berries, which I wanted to add in there, as my new love in life is berries, now having moved to Oregon. In general, animal pollinated crops are worth about $14 billion in the US, and they're about a third of our production and the majority of our nutrients. And if you break things down by their reliance on pollination, there is a big hunk of total production that is not animal dependent. These are things like cereals. So that big orange piece of the pie chart is corn and wheat and that kind of thing. But there's a large percentage that have either great or essential reliance on pollination. And all of these crops are what we'd call mass flowering or mass blooming crops. So they all have synchronous bloom at the same time, and that's what requires the pollination. An example of this is sunflower. So many of you guys maybe have gone up to the northern Central Valley, or even just the Central Valley around Fresno, where I'm from, and seen, fields of sunflower all blooming at the exact same time, and all of this needs pollination in that moment. Alongside those mass blooming crops, you often see these piles of colonies, so honeybee colonies that are brought in for pollination. Actually, I imagine now in SoCal, almost now you're going to start seeing those semi trucks going up the 60, carrying bees to the Central Valley, coming from warmer places like Arizona where they've overwintered. And those colonies are occupied by the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. So this is a managed bee in the United States. It was brought over actually by the Pilgrims, but a non-native species. However, in California, there is an incredible diversity of wild bees. They come in all sorts of shapes and colors and sizes. And there's actually about 1,500 to 1,700 species of wild bees in California. California is a hotspot, a global hotspot of bee diversity. Bees like places that have Mediterranean environments. And so we're actually kind of like the Amazon for bees, I like to say. They're way cooler than birds. What? Oh. That was for Morgan. And many of you have probably heard that bees are in decline. Some of the main culprits are things like pesticides, inadequate nutrition, so just not having habitat, not having flowers to visit, as well as diseases. And this graph, published by some colleagues over at the University of Vermont, basically red areas are really bad. That is areas where there is a really high pollinator need, pollinator dependence, but really low abundance of pollinators. So you can see the Central Valley is all red. Kind of over by LA is a little more purple. I think that's areas with a little bit less pollinator dependence. You can imagine a lot of crops in the region like citrus are not actually pollinator dependent, but still have incredibly low bee abundance. And so kind of to save our food system, as well as this incredible group of species that are hyper diverse in our areas, we have to ask, can we make agriculture better for bees? And there have been some techniques that people have worked out. That we have a review article out in the Ecology of Hedgerows and Field Margins book, where we summarize this work, where based on kind of two different restoration techniques. So one are cover crops. These guys are annuals planted down rows in orchards or underneath crops as well, if you have something that's not an orchard. And hedgerows. Hedgerows are mostly perennial. So here actually this picture has a bit of mix of perennial plants as well as annual plants. So they can have a bit of a mix. But these guys are planted usually along roads or irrigation ditches alongside alongside crops. And we found through a lot of 10 years, decades of work, that these on-farm habitat diversification, which is kind of the sum of what people call cover crops and hedgerows, can restore functionally diverse pollinator communities. And if you guys are interested in that type of work, take a look at the chapter we summarize it. But this is in some ways a little bit short-term thinking into it's like we can bring these bees there. It's sort of like if you build it, they will come. So we know that they will come, but then we really don't know much about their long-term health in these areas. So when we ask the question, can we make ag better for bees? There are some missing pieces. First is asking about this long-term health, and particularly about diseases. So bees are vulnerable to a suite of parasites and pathogens that are shared between species. That's both between wild bees and managed bees. And we're living through COVID right now. We know that when we get a lot of humans in one area, same with bees in one area, like for example, if we had a mass blooming crop, this might actually amplify disease transmission by aggregating all those hosts together in one place, visiting the same flowers, leading to potentially a lot of disease. At the same time, based on other wildlife studies, we know that something like on-farm habitat diversification, like those hedgerows, might help to dilute the transmission of disease by providing alternative flowers that might break up the chain of transmission. There's also this rather pesky piece of this, which of course is that humans are involved in adoption. And so only a really small fraction of growers use bee-friendly practices. And so we need to know what are the barriers and incentives that shape growers' adoption of these practices. So there is a lot of science out there that says, we can make agricultural landscapes non-terrible for bees, at least in the short term. The longer term is a little bit more open. We still need more research on that. But more than that, we just need to know, how do we even get people to do these things to help bees? And so today I'm going to talk about two different agricultural systems. This first will ask, do mass blooming crops amplify disease while on-farm habitat dilutes it? And this will be in the hybrid sunflower in the northern Central Valley. You guys notice the beautiful skies, just perfect when the wildfires are just right, getting those particulates in the air. And then we're going to move across California, asking almond growers from northern all the way to southern California, what are the barriers and incentives that shapes growers' adoption of bee-friendly practices, such as on-farm habitat diversification. So let's start in sunflower in the northern Central Valley. Bee parasites are, this will cause you never to look the same at flowers again. So the way bees get parasites is either through oral fecal, bee to bee interactions, or bee to flower interactions. So imagine you're in this beautiful field of wildflowers and you're thinking, how lovely, all these bees visiting them. But little did you know that bees are actually defecating on the flowers and then touching that and spreading it all around. And then, moving off, and the next bee comes and then picks up all of those parasites, ingests them as they're grooming themselves or, adding pollen to their bodies, and is then infected. So another way to look at this, so this is a bee actually defecating. So a lot of these parasites will basically give them like bee diarrhea. And so they'll defecate at higher frequency, they'll hit a flower. This is an image of like little bee footprints. So bees tend to like walk around flowers trying to find where the nectar is, where the pollen is, and then spreading those parasites around the flower. And then the next bee comes and picks it up. So flowers are basically bee bathroom door handles, and now you will never look at flowers the same way again. Yay. There are a whole variety of parasites we now know of that infect bees. This is mostly known from Apis, so this is the European honeybee because it's been studied for so long, but also bombus, which are another social bee that are like bumblebees. People maybe know bumblebees. And so more and more we've realized, though, that these parasites are transmitted between many different species. And so here are the 7 most common parasites we find, and all of them tend to have sublethal to lethal effects on the bee host or their progeny, and often are associated with something like dysentery, or they create a mode for transmission via the flowers. And just to convince you a little bit about how important parasites are in determining bee populations. So this is Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee. It used to be the most common bumblebee in California. And if you look at the points on the figure on the left, the black dots are where it used to be. And you can see that it extended through most of California, not quite maybe like as common in SoCal, but then the white dots are its current range. And we think that there was basically the introduction of, there was moving around of a queen between Europe that was sick. It's a little unclear how this happened, and they shouldn't have brought it back in the US, but they did. And then there was a huge outbreak of, I think, Nosema bombees, they're one of these parasites that led to just the decimation of the species and the extirpation from California. So they can have really, really large effects on these populations. So imagine then you're in this beautiful sunflower field and you're like, oh, how lovely, what a nice day, nice and gray from the smoke from the wildfires, not too warm. And now imagine that you look at that with the eyes of bee parasites, and you have all of these bees going back and forth between the rows, potentially spreading around parasites. So by bringing all these hosts to one area to visit this really abundant resource, we might be amplifying disease across the whole landscape. This is a hybrid sunflower system. You'll notice that some of the little plants look really different. So those are actually the male plants. They only produce pollen, and then the female plants only produce seeds. So these sunflowers are grown as a seed crop. They're not grown for eating sunflower. They're grown to produce the F1s that are then shipped off to other states to grow the crops that we might actually eat or produce oil from. And so they are 100% pollinator dependent. You need to move pollen from those male flowers to the female flowers to get a successful seed. And that's actually Hollis Woodard. She's a scientist. She's not a bee. She's at UCR right now. So she's one of my colleagues and collaborators. Another really interesting thing about this system is there are actually wild bees that are dependent on sunflowers. So those this picture was taken looking down under the sunflower plants, and you see these little tiny holes in the ground, and you can actually see the pollen on one of them. And those are the sunflower bee nests. So they like to nest at the base of their host plants, which are sunflowers, and are really intertwined with this entire system. So this is a sunflower specialist. She's really large. She's a really large bee, and relative to other bees. And so she has a lot of surface area potentially for picking up parasites from the flower as she's like moving around and that kind of thing. And she's also solitary. Morgan, do you have a question for me? Oh no, you just came back. Okay. And then amazingly, on this one flower, we also have this little generalist bee. This is Halictus ligatus. She's much smaller. We catch these guys everywhere. I catch them in Arizona, New Mexico. They have really broad distribution. They visit sunflower when it's out, but they visit lots of other species of flowers. And these guys are social, actually. So they it's not as social as we think of with honeybees or bumblebees, but they have a variety of sociality. And so we went out to these fields and we had some hypotheses we wanted to test. First of all, so through augmenting bee abundance in these areas, do mass blooming crops or mass flowering crops amplify parasitism? The other side of that is if we have on-farm habitat diversification, particularly hedgerows in this system, will this dilute parasitism by breaking up the chain of transmission? So we have flowers that have different anatomies, that might have different species visiting them. Does that, as we've seen in other wildlife, break up the chain of transmission? And we also expected more generalist bees, larger bees, and social bees will just in general have higher parasitism. So the generalist is because we thought, okay, you know, maybe if you're a generalist, you're not just visiting sunflower, you're going to all these other flowers, and maybe you're picking up stuff from sunflowers and bringing it to others, and thereby being exposed to a lot more parasites than something that was just visiting sunflower. Large bees, they have been seen to have higher rates of viruses and things like that. So we thought maybe because they have more surface area that's touching the flower, they'll actually pick up more parasites. And sociality, as we know, social distancing is key. And if you're a social bee, you can't social distance. So we thought that those social bees, because they're in more direct contact with each other and having that B2B content, they would also have higher rates of parasitism. So our study design was, we had a fully cross design where we had mass blooming crop fields. So those are the ones that are orange. We sampled them before and after bloom to get the whole kind of cycle of disease transmission. Half of those had hedgerows next to them, and half of them had just weedy field margins that could have been, some of them were really basically nothing, as in the picture on the left, and some had, you know, some mostly invasive kind of weedy flower species next to them. And then we also sampled fields with no mass blooming crops. So these were things like wheat, mostly wheat, and those had hedgerows or no hedgerows as well. This is my favorite hedgerow on the right. It's such a beautiful one. We took a lot of like lab photos in it. Here's looking down on, this is Yellow County, right? Actually, Davis, I think Davis or Winters is a little city right in the middle there. And so we had 12 different sites. We went out and sampled them repeatedly 6 times throughout the field season. And we sampled each time for an hour and a half. So there are some sites that are just hedgerows, no, you know, weedy field margin, those are in purple. Hedgerows plus sunflower in this case, those are the ones with the mass blooming crops, just weedy field margins, and the weedy field margins plus the sunflower. You'll notice in this system, the orange and the yellow are the sunflower fields. So there is a lot of sunflower being planted. I think Yellow County grows, I think it's around 80% of the sunflower seed, hybrid sunflower seed in the US. So it is a major producer of sunflower. And this crop is actually rotated through the landscape. They never plant it twice in the same location within 2 years back to back. It's a 3-year rotation. So you'll notice that, there's the orange and then there's the yellow, they never overlap. We're able, actually, using satellite data now, they're actually even able to see like sunflower that's come up. This is all based on satellite reflectance data. Sunflower that's come up even between fields and that kind of thing. You can see them on the map. And there is some amount of remnant habitat as well. That's in green. We've found that it's not terribly important for these bees because they herbicide sunflower in this landscape, any native sunflower, because they don't want it crossing with their crops. And there are some other hedgerows, those are in purple outlined, but not terribly many. There's a lot of concentration sort of over on the left, and that's actually hedgerow farms. So they're really known for their hedgerows. They grow hedgerow plants, and sell them to people. And we went out to these fields and we did what's called sterile collection. So you see, Hollis Woodard, scientist extraordinaire, showing that right now. She's got gloves on. We have insulated fanny packs with dry ice in them. And so we carry around individual sterile collecting tubes. The bees are so entranced in collecting pollen from these plants that we've found that we can just put a tube over them. We don't need a net or anything. We just put a tube over them, completely sterile collect them, sanitize our hands with ethanol and bleach, and then continue on. And we did time collecting in each of these fields. So some results: we collected 3,376 wild bees, and there's 35 unique species from 15 genera, which is pretty reasonable for an agricultural field. We screened about 1,500 of those. So because we had so many things to screen, we screened up to 5 of each species at each site, at each sampling unit, for all 7 common parasites. And we did just PCR. So this is plus or minus, like does it have this, or 0, 1, does it have this parasite or not? Only about 9% of the bees had no parasites, which is kind of amazing. Most of them had 1 parasite, about 45%. And some percentage of them had 2 to 3. The max was 3 of 7 of the parasites. It's kind of interesting. So our big question, part of our big question, do mass blooming crops enhance bee abundance? So that's kind of like, are they actually aggregating these hosts to this area? And we asked that in 2 different ways. One, just looking at the average abundance of bees in these different habitats we looked at. So the mass blooming crops, the hedgerows, and just the weedy field margins. And then one, actually asking, and this is a bit of a kind of an interesting point, I mentioned that these bees are laying their eggs in the fields and then and it's the same with all of them, where the resources of the previous year determine the population size in the next year. And so when we're thinking about how sunflower at the landscape scale controls these populations, it's the sunflower of the previous year. So we found on average that where you had sunflower had much higher abundance than if you only had hedgerows or only had weedy field margins. And we looked at this through day of the year because, of course, bees have a phenology. And so they sort of peak somewhere middle of the year. And then we did find a positive effect of the previous year's weighted sunflower area around it. So, we did the classic landscape ecology thing where we had buffers of sunflower in the previous year. And so if you had more sunflower around you the previous year, you had a higher abundance of bees, which is pretty interesting. Great. So then the question, does wild bee abundance amplify parasitism? And so we looked at the parasitism rate over on the y-axis, and this is just any parasite. Like, did you have any parasite at all? Doesn't matter what species. And then looking at that with wild bee abundance. And you'll notice that slope is positive. So we did indeed see that wild bee abundance amplifies parasitism. I was kind of squinting at this recently and wondering if I should fit more of a saturating function. But we do definitely see, you can see that where there's very few bees, you don't get a lot of your parasitism rate is low. And that goes almost all the way to 1 when you have really high bee abundance. Then, can hedgerows save us? If we have a lot of nice flowers around fields, does that mess up the transmission? So now on the x-axis, we have floral abundance. And again, we're looking at parasitism rate. And you can see that some sites actually had tons and tons and tons of flowers. And we actually do see a negative slope. So where there are more non-crop flowers, this is not sunflower, we see lower rates of parasitism than when there's just only crop flowers. One thing we noticed, though, is there was no difference between hedgerows and the flowers of weedy field margins. So when we were kind of looking for hedgerow effects and that kind of thing, didn't pick up anything. And we realized this is a histogram of the floral abundance in hedgerows, which are purple, and then the floral abundance in the weedy field margins. And actually, some weedy field margins are pretty awesome in terms of flower abundance. They can have just huge amounts of like brassicas and other highly attractive flowers to bees. And so that's why I think we picked up that it didn't matter whether it was hedgerow flowers or just any kind of non-crop habitat, which I thought was really interesting. And makes a pretty low bar. So that's that's a win for bees. Then looking at those functional traits, do larger bees have higher rates of parasitism because of that surface area quandary? And on the left, I have examples of like the level of size variation we picked up. So on the one side, there's Xylocopa californica. You guys may have seen our Xylocopa cabaniformis. You guys may see those around. They're these big, they're called carpenter bees. You'll sometimes get them nesting in your decks and things like that. So that's on the larger side of bees. And then we get tiny little bees called sweat bees. And we did indeed see that larger bees tended to host actually a higher parasitism rate and actually a higher richness of parasites. So they might just also have more space in their gut. These are gut parasites to accommodate them. Unclear there. Hopefully my colleagues at UCR who are working more on the mechanisms of these parasites, Quinn Frederick particularly, has been trying to understand what determines the infection of individual bees. So I'll let him get on that. So larger bees do have higher rates of parasitism. Interestingly, we did not find any significant effect of sociality or specialization/generalization. That was a bit of a conundrum for us. I think that one thing with the specialization that might be going on is that because sunflower really seems to be the primary transmitter in this system, we're actually now rinsing sunflower heads and looking at the parasite loads on them and comparing that to plants in the hedgerows and weedy field margins. We'd imagine that actually being generalized in the system isn't so bad because sunflowers are the main focal point. In addition, diets fluctuate, of course. And so when these mass blooming crops are in bloom, we know from removing pollen from their bodies that they're mostly just visiting sunflower. Like they're really focusing on that highly abundant, really great resource. So the generalists are even acting effectively like specialists. So no idea about the sociality situation. If anyone has any ideas. But so going back to our hypotheses, we did indeed find that through augmenting bee abundance, both within 1 year and through this like landscape effect of the sunflower planted in the previous year, mass flowering crops do amplify parasitism. On-crop diversification, or on-farm diversification, particularly hedgerows, do dilute parasitism by breaking up the chain of transmission. And it's also just not the hedgerows, it's also these weedy field margins that seem to be playing a role. And we found some evidence that particularly the large bees have higher rates of parasitism, so species traits do matter, but not much in terms of whether you're a generalist or a social bee. That doesn't seem to affect your parasitism rate. Great, so we have some next steps. Here is an awesome, this is a sunflower bee, and you can see she is just covered with pollen. And so she has basically a record of everything she visited on her. And so we can shake her up in some buffer solution and get all that pollen off her. And then we can use DNA metabarcoding, which is becoming more and more popular for bees to kind of go back in time and say, what is everything you visited before we caught and murdered you? And with that, we can build really interesting individual level interaction networks. We can also, which we did for the parasites, we can rip out their guts and we can sequence it. And more information has come out about the bee microbiome and particularly the bacteria microbiome. And it's mostly been focused on honeybees. So this is a honeybee, and we know a lot about the types of bacteria that are found in different sections of their gut. But in terms of native bees, we don't know a lot about how landscape is structuring that or how they're transmitting between species and things like that. So my two postdocs, Gordon Smith and Hamatal Cohen, they've been working on making these multi-layer networks that are like plants, bees in the middle, and parasites. And then you can imagine another slice coming out at you that's the bee microbiome. Couldn't quite get that to work pictorially. And so we have this, we have a mutualism, we have antagonisms, we have a very weird mutualism, more of a symbiosis in terms of the bacterial microbiome, and asking what are the different structures of interactions at play in with these different types of interactions. So we'll be asking, how does the individual network positions relate to the different, relate across the different interaction types? So if you're really central in the parasite network, does that mean you're also really central in the flower network, and those type of questions? How does the magnitude of interspecific variation vary depending on interaction type? One could imagine that you wouldn't expect a lot with the microbiome interactions, and you would expect a lot of variation in terms of the flower interactions, and sort of asking those questions on interspecific variation and interaction type. And we're also just really interested in how different traits of the bees, similar to what we looked at with the parasites, but also some really detailed information about their nesting behavior and their landscape characteristics around them are related to the microbiome. So how does this broader agricultural landscape structure that microbiome? Wonderful. So that is how mass blooming crops amplify disease. So now we're going to move over from the Northern Central Valley to more of a cross California question, looking at what are the barriers and incentives that shape growers' adoption of bee-friendly practices. Part of me wants to pause a moment for questions, but I'm like, should I give it a second? Or maybe.
Sure. If people want to, if they have questions at the first part, they can. I wrote down a question, so I'm happy. I know you want questions. I'll give you one.
Okay, Morgan, what's your question?
So you just talked about how basically if you have more flowers and hedgerows and things like that, that leads to this like dilution of the parasitism. And I was wondering how that works. Like, I think maybe you went over it, and can you talk about how that works for like generalists versus specialists? And like, is that dilution a interspecific effect, or is there also an intraspecific effect? So if like you're talking about these sunflower bees that are basically only on sunflowers in the first place, how diluted is their parasite load by those hedgerows as compared to another bee that is more of a generalist?
So you're asking, is there an interaction between the parasitism rate or the presence or absence of hedgerows, for example, and the generalization of the bee?
Yes, on parasitism.
And we didn't find much, and I think that does come again back to this. It's a funny thing. So since they are mostly visiting sunflower, like all of them are getting that sunflower pollen on them, we didn't find an effect of floral richness, which we were expecting. It is, of course, collinear with abundance, so it can be hard to tease out. But if you did the model with abundance versus the model with richness, you got a strong effect of floral abundance, but not the strong effect of floral richness. We saw something similar with bee richness. So bee abundance amplifies parasitism. Bee richness does not seem to be breaking it up. Again, they're collinear, so it's really hard to tease that apart. The mechanism, we think, the reason why we are now rinsing the flowers and trying to see what parasites on them is because we are a little like, by the mechanism, and exactly as you're saying, Morgan. And so my hypothesis is that just what other studies have shown is that the morphology of the flower in terms of transmission really matters. And so sunflower, as you imagine, it's like an open like plate that can just probably host a huge load of parasites. One thing though is that it's also really exposed to UV. And as we know from our beloved previous president, that UV light does break down viruses. So there's this kind of trade-off. And so it's like, okay, we think this is the primary mode, but maybe also they're really exposed to light. Whereas a lot of the hedgerow plants are more complicated flowers. So maybe they don't host the parasites as well. And so as long as you're bringing some bees that are visiting those other flowers a little bit, or then that's breaking it up. But I think the deep mechanism will be solved once we figure out the parasite loads on the individual flowers. Did that help?
Yeah. I'll let you continue now.
Okay. Yes, it is a bit of there have been some head scratcher moments in this. I guess with all ecology, but luckily we collected lots of frozen flowers. That was a good thing. I wish we'd collected more actual sunflowers. We were limited, of course, because they are a crop, and we, can't destroy the crop for the growers. They're not going to let us work in their fields. So I'm hopeful that we can maybe. I wonder if we're going to have enough samples of sunflower, unfortunately, but we'll at least be able to know the hedgerow flowers.
Before you go ahead, one quick question also came in, which is, so you were testing for up to 7 different parasites, and you found a maximum of 3. And, I guess the question is, why do you think the maximum was 3 out of 7? And do you think that there is any sort of additive effect on lethality, and that's why 3 was the maximum? Or are the parasites really species specific, and so you couldn't ever have gotten a maximum of 7 or something like that?
I think it's probably a mix of those two things. We did notice the nosemas. So there are 2 fungal parasites that are really commonly found in bumblebees and honeybees. We noticed, I'm not going to go into this in this seminar, but we also screened honeybees in these fields, and they were just full of I forgot the exact number, but a huge, over half of the honeybees we screened had these nosema parasites. We didn't really pick those up so much in the native bees. So some of it could be some species-specific effects. A lot of them don't seem to be, though. The Crithidias and the Ascosphaeras seem to be in really high levels across all of the species. So we're trying to understand a little bit. We also did parasite species specific models. And though across all of them, we still saw that effect of bee abundance amplifying parasitism rates, we saw some other kind of little fiddly differences between the different parasites that might lead us to believe there are different modes of transmission between them. There is very little known about these parasites. I think that, in particularly, Quinn McFrederick, our colleague, is a real innovator in this field in terms of trying to understand the mechanisms of infection. One other little point is that we don't know whether the bees are actively sick or not, right? They could be just carriers and not showing any symptoms. And so it's also unclear. We know that all of these parasites, they've all been fed to bees, and we can make bees sick, but we don't know if our bees were actively sick. Some people have also been doing more qPCR to look at the infection intensity. Can't really quite do that with all 7 we kind of trade off between really zooming into one parasite versus looking at more intensity levels in others. And we're also still, again, not sure. It's does the number of copies of nosema in your gut mean you're really sick or you're just a great carrier? so mixed on that one, but still a lot of exciting. In some ways, it's amazing to me that, we've known a lot about parasites in honeybees for a long time. Honeybees have so many issues, but the field of really understanding wild bee epidemiology, I think, is just opening up, and we're starting to get to those species-specific responses and that kind of thing. So more for the future. You can look forward to feeding more bees parasites, see whether we can get them sick. Sometimes research is a little depressing, but okay. Great. So now we've heard from the bees, and generally a positive story in terms of there are ways we can make agriculture a place the bees can survive to some extent. And there are some pretty low bars in terms of mitigation that we can do to make this habitat better, like hedgerows, or even in this case, just weedy field margins that are not herbicided. So now we have to ask, how do we get these growers to adopt these practices? And we focused on almond and not sunflower because almond is just such an incredibly important industry in California. And it is also an industry that is extremely heavily bee dependent. So many of you may know, California produces 80% of the world's almonds. Isn't this amazing? And there's this Almond Board of California, which is really just a force to be reckoned with, if you can imagine. I mean, you've probably seen their ads for eating almonds and that kind of thing. And as you saw from that picture, they really care about bees. Bees are, I think they're usually around their 1 or their 2 priority. It fluctuates between or concern water and then bees. So water bees, it can flips back and forth depending on what kind of year it is in terms of rainfall. So they're in that section of essential to great pollinator dependence. And so they are a mass blooming crop. So you probably are familiar with driving through the Central Valley. You probably drove through Fresno sometime, and right around February, around Valentine's Day, everything turns into this amazing bloom. There's a whole blossom trail that you can go through. And maybe you didn't know, however, that this crop is entirely pollinator dependent. They actually plant different lineages to make sure there's cross-pollination between these lineages to get pollination. They are completely self-infertile. So if a bee goes from one flower to another flower on the same tree, it does not produce an almond, which is like that level of pollinator dependence. It blooms for only about 3 weeks across all of California in February. So all of these acres are blooming at that time. And they're about 1.3. This fluctuates up and down a little bit depending on what acres have been removed from bearing or what, but let's say 1.3 million acres. This is larger than the area of multiple countries in the world, like Trinidad, Samoa, and Luxembourg. That is the amount of production in California. And I grew up in Fresno, and so I grew up with this surrounded. And I would say that it took driving all across California for another project and going to these various almond fields to really understand the scale of almond that's now being grown, because so much of it is invisible off. You can drive down 5 and you can see a lot of it, but then it just stretches sort of infinitely from the coastal range to the Sierra Nevada. It's pretty amazing. So we want to ask, what incentivizes growers to do these bee-friendly practices? So some almond growers are doing bee-friendly practices in their fields. And so this work was really led by Jenny Durant, my postdoc. And so we sent out a survey to growers, and we asked them about their operational details, whether or not they grew cover crops, whether or not they installed pollinator habitat like hedgerows. There are also some almond board best management practices I won't get into a lot of. They're really honeybee focused. We also asked, are you interested in a bee-friendly certification? So there's been this new upsurgence of these little stickers called Bee, for example, one is Bee Better certification that the Almond Board has had some interest in. So like if you do some practices, you get this nice certification, like the seafood, like the seafood or paper product kind of certifications, and get some kind of little dollar incentive for that. And then we also just asked them generally about their pollination concerns in 2020. This is an example of what the survey looked like. So they could, they had a variety of concerns they might be interested in. They could select as many as they wanted. And we ended up with about 329 respondents. So we advertised via postcard. We went to almond board meetings. We paid people to do the survey. We paid them $20, which was included in the grant. And that, I think, really upped our participation. So we assumed, this survey did take people between 10 and 20 minutes to fill out. So we gave them a $20 gift card. And we ended up getting about 14% of the industry's acreage in 2019, which is pretty darn solid. If you, in terms of representation of different counties, it looks pretty similar to the intensity of almond cultivation. We have a little bit of over-representation in Stanislaus County. They just, a little bit higher percentage of them filled out our survey, though they are one of the top producers of almonds in California. But we got all of the counties represented. Fresno over there is the one that's green and looks like an upside down megaphone or something like that. So, and in general, we got pretty good response rates in terms of demographics of what we think the industry is, which is primarily male. They are primarily, there's an interesting kind of bimodal distribution. Well, there's a mostly people but in their 20s to their 60s. That's usually their age range. They're mostly primary owner operators. And in terms of acreage, we got about the distribution of acreage we tend to see. So the majority of almond farms, like 40%, are in the 1 to 20 to 49 acreage range. And then there's some that are about 12% that are over 1,000 acres. And we really want to ask them about, these two bee-friendly practices, in particular, cover crops, which are annuals. And so they tend to be a lot easier to put in and manage. They're, you plant the seeds, they have their own nuances and issues, but they're not a permanent investment. They can, you can decide to put them one year and not the other year. And versus hedgerows. Hedgerows or riparian strips are something that really is like a permanent habitat fixture. So this is what we'd call permanent habitat. It didn't have to be something like a hedgerow, but it's something that's more of an investment than a cover crop. And so in terms of adoption rates of bee-friendly practices, I highlighted some key points here. So what was interesting to us was that a lot of growers were actually interested in cover crops. So that's highlighted in yellow, CCs as cover crops. They were much less interested in permanent pollinator habitat. That's the PH. So most growers are not interested, though maybe second to that is not sure. Again, that is a bigger investment. I won't go too into this, but I thought this was just a really interesting point about the industry. So there are these bee best management practices, some of which are legally obligated. There are three main ones. Do you always read pesticide labels? Do you tell your beekeepers you're about to spray bee toxic pesticides? And do you avoid spraying the hives directly? So, I mean, and so they are legal, they are legally obligated. And we only had about, people individually reported that, there's only about 60% adoption of these legally obligated BMPs. So this is the industry we're facing. I mean, a lot of these are really large scale ag, so they might see these things as really difficult to implement. One really interesting thing, though, was that we saw a solid amount of interest in bee certification. So about 47% of growers were moderately interested in bee certifications, which seems like it might be a good way to get people involved. But in general, we want to know, okay, we know that there are some growers out there who have adopted these practices already. Who are they? And what are some factors that led to this adoption? And we thought there might be three main pieces. First, geographic. You guys know that, almond is grown all the way from the Southern California all the way up to really far Northern California. That covers a huge range of precipitation. And so we grouped growers by the Sacramento Valley, the North San Joaquin, and the South San Joaquin based on kind of average rainfall. And also we'd imagine there might be some social factors in play there as well. We also thought that there might be influential people that could really impact their decision-making. So for example, some people might know their beekeepers and really rely on them for making pollination decisions. In this system, a lot of times there's such demand for bees that they have someone in between them and the beekeeper, which is a bee broker. And so you call a bee broker and you're like, I need, 100,000 colonies. That's an overestimate. Maybe. And then the bee broker rounds up all these beekeepers and brings those colonies to the fields, or the beekeepers bring them, but he makes sure those contracts get signed. And so, maybe you have this really influential bee broker in your life and they're telling you what's going on. And there are also pest control advisors. These people tend to be really important when it comes to kind of dissemination of scientific knowledge and best practices. Based on other literature, we thought that whether or not you owned the orchard might be really important. So are you someone who can actually invest in permanent habitat and that benefits you if you're an owner? One interesting part of this industry, though, is most people are owners. And then acreage, maybe if you're a huge, enormous, over maximum acreage we had was 38,000. So you manage 38,000 acres. Maybe you're less likely to want to do all these fiddly things that might cause more time and effort into putting them in. Or on the flip side of that, maybe you have a lot more money and you can invest in something that might help your pollination in the future. We also thought, potentially, what if there are just certain concerns about bees that really motivated people. So this is a breakdown of the major, or we thought would be major concerns, bee-related concerns. So are you worried about loss of native pollinators? Are you worried about, lack of skilled beekeepers, as well as lack of available colonies? We found these to be really similar, the responses for those. Are you just generally worried about declining bee health? Is this a real big concern of yours? Or are you really worried about colony cost? And what you'll notice is that actually colony cost really comes out as something that a lot of people are worried about. Very few people said they were not concerned about colony cost, whereas loss of native pollinators was maybe less on people's radar. Not surprising for this industry. And so what we did is we ran a model selection. And so we had all these variables in the model, and we let the model choose which were the variables that came out in our top set of models. And then we use model averaging to estimate the coefficients. So for example, these are the growers that grew cover crop in the past 5 years. And the grayed out boxes are where we found statistically significant effects of these variables. So in terms of region, we found that if you were more likely to have grown cover crop in the San Joaquin Valley, the Sacramento Valley, than in the North and South San Joaquin. This follows a prediction that rainfall really determines whether you're going to implement some of these practices, which may need additional irrigation. People were also less likely to have grown cover crops if they had a strong or moderate concern in the cost of bee colonies, which is a little counterintuitive. But it kind of follows this as well as the lack of available colonies. So if you were very concerned or moderately concerned about the lack of available colonies, you were more likely to grow cover crop. So it's kind of this, we thought of this, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like if you're not concerned about, bees coming and showing up and pollinating, you're not going to do anything in terms of growing cover crops to try to fix that. Whereas if you are really, and then the flip side, if that makes sense. Yes, it took us a little bit of scratching, but when you think of this industry as a really just financially motivated industry that aren't going to put money somewhere where they don't need to, it makes sense. And so looking at the other two pieces, the pollinator habitat, so this is the more permanent habitat fixtures, and the interest in bee certification, you'll notice there's not a lot of pattern except region. So in each of these practices, region comes up as statistically significant, and particularly the Sacramento Valley also plants more pollinator habitat and is more interested in bee certifications. One other thing you'll notice is that the people seem less important. So there's not very many effects of influential PCAs or bee brokers or influential beekeepers. If the squares are not outlined in gray, it's a marginal effect. P value less than 0.1. We thought we'd just throw it on there. So that was also really surprising, that not that many people said that beekeepers were really influential to them, and then that was not a deciding factor on whether they adopted bee-friendly practices. Another interesting point is, which then again goes with this, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is that if you are very satisfied with your colony strength, so you're like, bees are coming to my fields, they're doing great pollination, you are less likely to care about you are less likely to have grown pollinator habitat. It goes again with that, don't need to invest money on it. Bees are fine. Great. Okay. So there's a lot in that one. But we wanted, so why would we think that region would be so important across all of these practices? And mainly, we think it comes down to water. And we did ask the growers what their highest water price was, but due to IRB specifications, we can't force growers to answer any of these questions, or we can only have a certain number. And something like the highest price of water might be something that's very personal. And so we didn't have a huge response rate on this, so we couldn't directly include that in the models, which is why we kind of used region as a proxy. But in general, with the data we do have from the growers, as well as many other studies, water is a lot more expensive in the South. I mean, we know, you guys are in LA, there's less water, it costs more. Whereas in the Sacramento Valley, water is a little bit more plentiful and there's more rainfall. Remember rainfall? It rains a lot in Oregon, I will say that. So then we wanted to dig into, and I was kind of debating, like me and my postdoc found this incredibly fascinating, and anyone who's worked with almond growers and that were like, oh my gosh, that's so neat that they found these specific incentives. So, but I think I'm not going to get too much in the weeds of specific incentives and challenges. I just wanted to give you guys an overview of the type of things we found. If you want to ask me more questions later, I can go back to these slides. But the key thing here is that the biggest incentive people found was increased strength of bee colonies. So that is what they care. If they're going to be doing these practices, one of the biggest incentives is like, we want to make our honeybees stronger. We want better pollination. You'll notice that nothing about native bees kind of pops up on this, which is, again, not surprising. Something I was toying with, so if we think of these, this is my ecologist brain, like if we think of these incentives like species and growers' minds like sites, we can look at the community composition of incentives. And I had this hypothesis that this might be really different depending particularly on what region you were in. Like that, maybe the North San Joaquin had a different community composition of incentives than the South San Joaquin. However, we didn't really see that. We really saw homogenization of community composition in terms of incentives between the regions. And I also looked at acreage ranges and ownership and those kind of things, and nothing came out. There's just one weird grower over on the side who's just got some I think they said they weren't concerned about anything. And so, but everyone else is kind of blobbed right next to each other. With permanent habitat incentives, we saw the same thing as cover crop. Increased strength of colonies during bloom is their number one incentives. Not much else in terms of native bees or that kind of thing. Similarly, decreased rental fees for managed colonies was another big incentive, which is pretty similar again to this honeybee thinking. And homogenization of these concerns as well. Again, one weird grower who is not very concerned about much, or is not incentivized by much. In terms of challenges, people were really worried about the cost and effort to maintain these things, including cover crops. And I also highlighted the second one there, which is increased risk of frost damage. And this one was particularly interesting as coming out as so in growers' minds as being important, because there's basically one study out there that showed when you have vegetation on the ground, that lowers the soil temperature. And as you guys know that when you have something blooming in February and you have a frost, this can destroy your crops. So frost is a huge concern. But this one study really motivated people's concerns about frost damage. Of course, also with climate change, this is becoming even less of a problem. Like frost events during almond bloom are less and less frequent, but it's still stuck there in growers' minds as something incredibly important. So just interesting how those ideas can continue. And similar to the incentives, we didn't really see much differentiation of incentive community composition by region. Everyone seems to feel the same way about various incentives. And similar to cover crops, this like effort and cost to maintain them is a major challenge for permanent habitat, as well as lack of available land, which is another interesting one because these are usually planted where there would be nothing. So they're usually planted like along irrigation ditches or along roads. And so the goal is not to remove land from production, but it's this kind of concern that's sticking with people like, oh, I'll have to like take almond out of production to have a hedgerow, which is not the case. And similar homogenization. So the take homes here are, there's just really no silver bullet in terms of like, this is the thing, this is the concern, this is the person that has changed people's minds and they'll adopt these bee-friendly practices. There's no like take home that we can tell the conservation agencies like, hey, this is what you should be doing. Seems particularly very region specific. And so some other factors, the region does seem to play a really important role in determining adoption. And so a lot of times when we talk about the almond industry, we talk about the almond industry as a whole, but there may need to be more region-specific approaches to extension, particularly with regard to water availability. And the satisfaction with the strength and price of bee colonies also played an important role with certification, and particularly like if people were satisfied they didn't feel like they needed to do anything. But if they were dissatisfied, they were more likely to say they were interested in cover crops or permanent or in habitat or certification, which is a little counterintuitive in terms of thinking about how we can get positive change to happen. Like, you want growers to be satisfied with their bees, but then they're not incentivized to do bee-friendly practices. In general, increasing honeybee strength is the number one incentive. So this industry is 100% in on honeybees, and that's where they care. And so there doesn't seem to be much room in terms of talking about native bee conservation. We really should be focusing on honeybees with this group. And overall, these PCAs, brokers, beekeepers did not have much effect on people's adoption of practices. In terms of next steps, so what really stuck in my head about this homogenization of incentives and challenges was, growers talk with each other, as well as those weird ones that popped up that, maybe the scientific community who's been working on this for a while would say, like, frost damage isn't really a thing with cover crops anymore. There was just one paper, we haven't really seen that as effect, but there seemed to be some really united way that people were coming up with these, incentives and challenges. And my hypothesis is that is the almond board itself. So the almond board is incredibly powerful. They have a meeting every year that all these growers go to. And so I imagine that they're this really central node in this network of growers. And so now we're following up with interviews. So we're going to our survey respondents and asking them if they'll have a long interview with us. And we're going to ask them about the people in their lives, including members of the almond board, that are really influential to their decisions. And our goal is to build a really cool social network where we can try to understand information spread through this network. Maybe that will help us understand where to target. But my feeling is the almond board. They are awesome people too. I mean, they really care about bees, which is, I think shows how powerful it can be if they can communicate that more. So in terms of asking the question, can we make ag better for bees?
Hey, Lauren.
Yeah.
So we're a bit over time.
Oh, okay. Oh man. Okay, yeah. We're done.
Yeah. Sorry.
That is actually the last.
I wouldn't have stopped you for the fact that I'm actually late to go teach. So I need to cut out.
Sorry about that.
But thank you so much. And I will be speaking to you later. And I know you have other meetings this afternoon.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Sorry for going over time. I think sometimes it's hard with the Zoom meetings. You just kind of.
Yeah, it's really cool. But thank you.
Great. Okay. Bye, everyone.